And US President Donald Trump addressed business leaders at the World Economic Forum in Davos yesterday. Joining us live is independent economist Saul Eslake. Saul, thank you very much for joining us. He spoke about plans to increase America's fossil fuel production and wants to reduce inflation by cutting regulation, implementing new tariffs and cutting taxes. How do you see this playing out?
I think that President Trump has a mandate for the policies that he took to last November's election, and given that the Republicans have majorities, albeit thin ones, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's likely that he'll be able to implement most of what he promised that he would do. While some of those things may be popular, I think that they will ultimately result in higher inflation and higher interest rates, notwithstanding the comments that President Trump made in his address to the World Economic Forum in Davos yesterday. Let's run through three of them. He's promised to impose a 60% tax, he calls it a tariff, on everything the US imports from China, and it imports a lot from China, and 10% tariffs on everything the US imports from every other country. Now, he's modified that to some extent. He's not proposing, at least initially, to increase tariffs on China by the full 60%, but rather by 10%. On the other hand, he's proposing to impose higher taxes of 25%, rather than 10, on everything the US imports from Mexico and Canada, which are the US's second and third biggest sources of imports. Now, again, they may be negotiating tactics, and it's possible that tariffs won't increase by as much as he's proposed, but certainly they will result in higher prices for a broad range of goods, and some credible estimates made before the election suggest that the impact of those would be greatest on lower income households. The average household, it's been calculated, would be about $2,600 a year worse off as a result of the higher prices that would flow from the taxes, the tariffs that Trump says he will impose on goods imported into the United States. Second, as your previous story just highlighted, Trump proposes to deport a large number. Estimates are somewhere between about 1.3 and a little over 8 million immigrant workers. Sometimes the suggestion is even those who are legally in the United States rather than simply those who are illegally or undocumented. That will result in shortages of workers, particularly in agriculture, food production, and in construction, including of housing. That's likely to result in higher labour costs, which will be passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Third, Trump has proposed fiscal policies, in particular cuts in personal and corporate income taxes, or at least extending the cuts in personal and corporate income taxes that he legislated in his first term that are due to expire in the middle of this year. He's proposing to extend those without proposing how those tax cuts will be paid for. So at face value, Trump's policies will result in the budget deficit that's already running at an extraordinary 6.5% of GDP by perhaps another 2 percentage points. In an economy that's at full employment, which the US is, that will be inflationary as well. So at least three of President Trump's policies are going to add to inflation, and that would normally result in higher interest rates. Trump is now claiming that he understands interest rates better than the Federal Reserve and that he somehow will direct the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. The Federal Reserve is not going to do that. The Federal Reserve is an independent central bank, and if anything, if Trump seeks too hard to pressure in the Federal Reserve, it might increase interest rates by more than it otherwise would in order to demonstrate to financial markets and anyone else who's interested that the Federal Reserve is determined to maintain and safeguard its independence.
What about, we've got to wrap it up shortly, but what about from an economic point of view? He says that he's pulling out of the Paris Accord, which will save $1 trillion. What are your thoughts on that from the economic side?
Well, I'm not sure how it does save $1 trillion. Apart from anything else, as we've seen a couple of events in the last 6 months, the hurricane that hit North Carolina and the fires that devastated large parts of Los Angeles, the costs associated with the more frequent damaging weather events that are occurring that almost everyone accepts is the result of climate change. Those costs will continue to escalate over the medium to longer term if the world doesn't move to reduce its carbon emissions. And the Paris Agreement, for all its flaws, is one path to doing that. He isn't proposing another one.
And just quickly, the impact on Australia, we have 4% of our exports to the US, I believe. How do you think that we perhaps might be impacted?
Well, it's possible we won't be impacted at all if the Australian government is able to persuade the Trump administration, as Mr Turnbull and Scott Morrison were while they were Prime Ministers, that Australia is one of the few countries that the US runs a trade surplus with. So in the way that Trump looks at these things, we could argue that we are not, quote, cheating, unquote, when it comes to trade. In fact, the truth is that it's the Americans who are imposing discriminatory trade policies against Australia. But if we are subject to tariffs, the industries that would be hardest hit would be beef and other meat. And more than a quarter of our exports of those products go to the United States. And although we don't export a lot of pharmaceuticals and aircraft parts, medical and measuring instruments, about half of what we do export under those headings go to the United States, so they could be adversely affected. The biggest damage to Australia would be, of course, if our government was stupid enough, and it would be stupid, to retaliate against US tariffs on Australian exports to the US by imposing tariffs on Australian imports from the US. We import about 11% of what we bring into the country from the United States, and that includes a significant range of equipment used, for example, by farmers, tractors, combine harvesters and the like, quite a lot of other machinery, aircraft, pharmaceuticals. Again, we import a lot from the United States. If we were stupid enough to imitate the damage that America is proposing to do to its own consumers by doing the same thing to our own consumers, then the result would be higher prices and probably higher interest rates in Australia. And the burden of that would be disproportionately borne by people with illnesses that require ongoing medical treatment, farmers, manufacturers, and people who travel by plane.
All right, we've got to wrap it up, but Saul, thank you very much. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.